So thank you very much for make it possible to speak here. Ladies and gentlemen, I will talk about a quite strange topic, namely parapsychology. And it's, of course, a challenge for science, and it doesn't work. Yes, now. But for me, paranormal is quite normal. It's normal, but quite different. Now, I have to explain to you what I'm doing. I share a project which is funded by the government of Baden-Württemberg, and this project is a parapsychological counseling office. So we help persons who have strange experiences which themselves call paranormal. And I am both a physicist and psychologist and try to understand what persons experience. And of course, part of the experiences we get by letters, emails, and such reports can be understood in a quite conventional way. But there are another sort of experiences which I cannot really explain because I have not enough information of what's going on. But the third part is much most interesting. It are reports which, if you take them as given, you really cannot understand. And we now heard the first slide, the first letter, I hope, that displays such an experience. Can you start?
In front of my eyes, the following happened. We sat in the living room together with Karen. She had placed herself on the sofa and had fallen asleep. Our dog was lying on the end of the sofa near Karen and slept. My husband and I watched TV, and it was otherwise completely silent in the room. Suddenly, the dog was startled and clenched unnaturally, then flew through the living room, glanced at the cabinet wall, trying to stand on his legs. First, he failed. His whole body was shaking. Then it was all over. He behaved as if nothing had happened. Then, I had witnessed something happening on the living room table. Karen's glasses lay on the TV magazine, and I could not believe my eyes. When the glasses raised very slowly and then back towards the newspaper. Karen went up briefly, and the dog looked astonished in his comic movements. Then the dog went to Karen and put his head on her lap.
So this is a letter she reports to me, and now the question, what's going on? And now, of course, parapsychologists have tried to give a name to such things. So they invented the concept of psychokinesis. Of course, this is not at all an explanation. It's just a word to indicate that we do not know what it is. But we can make a definition of it. And the definition is, well, psychokinesis, it's a description, it's not an explanation, is a direct mental interaction with external physical processes. So the dog is an external physical process to the person, to Karen, and also her spectacles are an external object, and it moves without any cause. There is no reason why this should be. Well, at the end of the letter, Karen says, well, such things happen very often to her. They shouldn't be disturbed. So this is a good answer, I think. Now, let's look what science did with this concept. Well, of course, already 100 years ago, they tried to investigate it with scientific methods. So they did experiments where dice are thrown and a person, a subject, should try to influence the dice in a way that they get a certain number and such things. And of course, G.B. Ryan, an American biologist and professor, he did thousands of such experiments. However, the scientific community was not convinced at all. And there was a long debate which lasted over 30, 40 years. And finally, Oh, it does not work. So, can you just take the next slide, please? Okay. Here you see the first result, which was published by a group at the Princeton University. Bob Chan, he was chair of this group. They published in a well-respected engineering journal an experiment, and you can see what happened. They had a random number generator which produced only ones and zero, and the subject was instructed to produce more ones. This is the upper curve, and after a while the subject had to produce as little ones as possible, and this is a baseline which just has to control that the random number generator did not make mistakes. So this was published in 81, and this was the first time in parapsychology when the critics and the skeptics said, well, we cannot find any methodological error with this experiment. Everything is described, everything is okay, and the result is highly significant. You need not even see need statistic to see the difference. But they said it's not enough. But there was a problem, because if you take a physics textbook or a psychology textbook, you would not find such an effect. Okay, at that time, they did a meta-analysis and found that many of such experiments showed such effects. So there was a theoretical problem. And this was in 2002, when the first time in history a theory was published in Foundation of Physics, which is a well-respected physical journal, which may be an explanation for this strange effect. The title is Weak Quantum Theory, Complementarity and Entanglement in Physics and Beyond, by three authors, Harald Admantbacher, Hartmann Römer, and Harald Wallach. Well, both are, all these are friends of mine, and I know what they did. Well, I will just explain it to you. They started from the point that they said, well, in science, we have one very successful theory, which is quantum theory. Quantum theory holds not only for the small particles, but also for computers, beamers, and even in cosmology, you can apply quantum mechanics. So they say, this is something very interesting. We have a theory of everything. Now let's look what parts of this theory are not physical. Probably they will help us to understand what's going on with these strange psychophysical experiments. Now, they need only little concepts of quantum theory, namely the concept of system, which is very clear. A system is everything which you can describe, say by words or by mathematics. Well, a system can have a certain state. For instance, the state of the temperature in this room is rather high. Okay, and if we want to describe a state, we need something, namely an observable. An observable is a thing which you can measure, for instance, the temperature, or the length of this object, or the weight of this object. So we call this an observable. An observable is something which can be measured. Now, in quantum physics, there is something which is really counterintuitive. One has found out that some very simple observables, like velocity, for instance, or the location of a particle, have a strange property, namely that it makes a difference whether you first measure the velocity and then the location, or otherwise round. So if this is the case, if you get a different result, if you first measure A and then B, and you get a different result if you measure first B and then A, then you call these two observables complementarity. Okay, this is complementary observables. So it's not something very important at first glance. But if you look to psychology, it's quite normal. But nearly all observables in psychology are complementary. For instance, if I would measure your mood now, I give you a questionnaire and I found that you are a little bit tired, but you are in good mood. Now, the second measurement, I give you an intelligence questionnaire. Well, it would be much warmer here in this room, and you can imagine that it would make a big difference if I would measure the mood before or after the intelligence score. Now you see, this is something quite genuine, but it has dramatic consequences. And this is entanglement. So in systems where you have complementarity, you get entanglement. What is entanglement? Now, the next slide, okay. Entanglement means that if you have a system which contains complementary observables, the system creates patterns or correlations independent of spatial and temporal distances. So even if you separate the system, there will be patterns which fit together. So, and you can test this. And we did this. You can, I just explained, but the disadvantage of such entanglement correlations is that they follow the so-called NT axiom, which means non-transmission axiom. So these patterns are not causal. They are different. And if you try to use these entanglement patterns or correlations in order to use them in order to get a signal or a causal influence, they disappear. But they do not disappear immediately, but to a certain rule. And this rule says, for instance, if you do such experiments, the next slide, please, that if you do such experiments like Bob Jahn had done, the anti-axiom says, if you start with a certain deviation from chance and you repeat the experiment again and again, the deviation from chance will disappear due to a very simple rule, namely 1 over square root n, if n is the number of repetitions. So we tested this prediction of this entanglement model with the data of a meta-analysis of all the experiments which were available at 79. These are about 600 experiments. And the prediction is these points, each is an own experiment, they must all be below these red lines or above this red line. So you see this fits perfectly. So we know that the effect which was found and called psychokinesis is not a force, it's not causal, it's an entanglement effect. So this was the starting point to test this again, and what we did is a kind of man-machine interaction. We put together a person with a machine with a random number generator, and in order to get them entangled, as you see here, we give them an instruction. So So this is the instruction. The instruction was to the person, well, you see here a red ribbon which is changing randomly. Try to push it in a given direction. And if the experiment is successful, then of course we will get entanglement correlation between both. Now you see the next slide, please. Here, this was a display. It was just a red ribbon, and this ribbon moved up and down randomly, and there were two keys for the subject. The keys, the subject were told, push the keys in order to get the ribbon into the middle in this case, or out of the display, or to keep it in the middle. So these were the three instructions, and the subject had, well, they did not know that the key presses were simply recorded but had no connection at all to the random process. But most of them were convinced that they could do it. Now let's look at the results. The results show these are the column are the psychological variables. These are simply the button pushes over the whole period of the experiment. These are different statistical physical variables describing the physical random process. And now if you test for correlations, of course 500 persons to do this, if you look for correlations you find in this matrix, of course, if you test, say, for 10% significant, you find 10% correlations randomly. So this is nothing important. This is without a real experiment. This is a control. But if the persons are engaged with the experiment, you see that much more significantly, highly significant, more correlation appear. So this says the process has something to do with the person. But to be certain that this is really an entanglement correlation and not a signal or a causal influence, we repeated the experiment, and the prediction is, due to the NT axiom, that in the second experiment we get also an excess of correlation, but they are at different places. They cannot be at the same place again, because otherwise it would be causal. So we have a real proof for the fact that this is no causal influence, it's something different. Okay, so next slide, please. In nature, of course, we do not such experiments. Causal connections, causal processes, and entanglement processes are not separated. For instance, it's like this sponge. It's dry, you cannot do very much with it. Here I have water, it's liquid, like entanglement. The NT axiom, you cannot use it, but if you put them together, then you can clean your flat, that's fine. Okay, so we come to the flat. Now, we applied this model now to poltergeist phenomena, as you heard in the beginning. Now, if you look at such a poltergeist, it's really strange. I had been at flats, and people say to me, it was completely disorder, everything was thrown around, and they said to me, well, we have a problem, we have not done this. Can you help us? Okay, I can help, because we found out that such strange things do not happen very seldom. They are very often. Every week we have such a case. Okay, what can we do? We can look at persons, because I said it has to do with the persons involved, and we call this the focus person. And if we look for the age of the person, we find that most of the persons are in the age between 9 years and 16 years. You know this age, it's a very complicated age, it's a puberty. And we know in this age, persons have problems. But very often they do not realize it. So we have one constituent. This is a problem which is not realized, it's not conscious. So we found that there are 5 constitutions for such persons. First, they have an unconscious problem. Second, they have an ability to externalize. What does that mean? It means if you have a problem, you do not think about it, but you put it in your vicinity. For instance, if you are shot with your car by a flash, then most say, well, it was not me, I drive quite carefully. These police, they have built a trap for me. This is externalization. So externalization is a psychological problem to get rid of problems. And some persons are very skilled to do such, and we call this dissociative persons. They are, it's a gift, it's not an illness. They mainly can do wonderful things. They are artists, they can get good relation to other persons and such things. And of course, you need an observer, a person who can see the poltergeist, because it's a kind of stage where you can show something, namely your problem, in a symbolic way. And the final finding was that those persons are very robust. They do not get ill. So the good news are, a poltergeist is nothing which you should threaten. A poltergeist is something very nice. Nature has found a way to avoid a psychosomatic reaction which you would get if you do not have these abilities. So a poltergeist is nothing else than a psychosomatic reaction outside of the body of the focused person. So they do not go to a psychiatric clinic, they remain healthy, and this is a good thing. So exactly, we do not know the details of the process. We have some idea, we call this super fluctuations, but this is very complicated and we need another 100 years to understand this in detail, but we know what a poltergeist is. Now I hope the last letter will work now. This is a very fierce poltergeist, and the lady solved it. Well, I instructed her at the telephone, and she wrote me an email and described how she got rid of the poltergeist simply by knowing what I just told you. So can we get?
I think that I can make the fortunate report that the poltergeist has vanished. My first assumption after the telephone conversation was that the house does not like me, and I do not like the house. But since the phenomenon did not disappear, I thought that this cannot be the problem. And besides, this would have been a known problem. When I looked through my notes, I found that all objects which were destroyed had a relation to my mother. To explain this, I must say that my mom and I had a very close relationship. With no other person I have ever experienced that the line was occupied when I tried to phone her because she also tried to phone me. The first poltergeist phenomenon happened the night after Mother's Day this year. I was kicked by someone in bed. In this moment I thought, "Mom, help me." The same night, a vase on the table broke in 4 parts. It contained flowers for her. The photo that bounced against me showed Mom's dog. The flower pots that fell down were from her, and also the cupboard. The marble table which broke when the bookshelf tilted also had a relation to my mother. During these days, we had enough time to talk to each other, and my feeling that she was not well during the last few months was confirmed. Last year, she tried to commit suicide and had told me that she was desperate. She tried to move to us, but she saw no possibility to do this. Now we try to find a home for her. I am rather sure that this was the solution. Well, if you ask me now why I didn't find it earlier, I don't know. Yet, it was so obvious.
Thank you. Now, I
want to thank you very much.
Okay. Now you see, it's not threatening if you have a poltergeist. Well, I wish you, if you once have a poltergeist, you are not threatened and you know you are well. Thank you very much.